Parents stole my college fund, forced me to work, and then tracked me down after I cut them off. Looking back, my childhood always felt more like a job than a time for being a kid. My parents, John and Susan, were polished, successful professionals, my dad, a sharp corporate lawyer in his mid-50s, and my mom, a poised real estate agent a few years younger. But as much as they thrived in their careers, they seemed utterly unprepared for parenting. Honestly, it felt like I was just a box they checked off on their life plan. They had me relatively young, but instead of embracing the role of parents, they poured their energy into keeping up the appearance of a perfect, upper-middle-class life. To the outside world, we were this picture-perfect family, nice house, nice cars, fancy dinners. But inside those walls, it was a different story. I wasn't treated like their daughter so much as a burden, or worse, an unpaid assistant who was expected to fall in line and not disrupt their carefully curated image. Every accomplishment I managed to achieve, good grades, academic awards, was met with indifference or dismissed outright. That's what you're supposed to do, they'd say, like there was nothing worth celebrating. Over time, it became painfully clear that my worth to them was tied to how much I could contribute to their lives or make them look good. Everything came to a head during my senior year of high school. My mom lost her job suddenly, and she never explained why. To this day, I don't know if she quit or got fired, but one day, she was home all the time. Then, my dad got hit with his own career blow. He was let go from the law firm he'd been with for years. Losing both incomes was a devastating blow, and the cracks in their perfect facade started showing. They couldn't keep up with the mortgage, bills, or the lifestyle they'd built around themselves. Instead of coming together as a family, all of their stress and frustration seemed to land squarely on me. At the time, I was working a part-time job while keeping up with my studies, trying to save for college and cover my own expenses as much as possible. When I earned a scholarship that covered most of my tuition, I felt a wave of relief, thinking that, finally, I wouldn't have to rely on them financially. But when I shared the good news, expecting some kind of support or pride, they immediately turned it into something about them. My dad started making comments about how that scholarship money could help the family, while my mom suggested I should delay college and work full-time to help them get back on their feet. She even said something like, a real adult would do whatever it takes to help their family. The final straw was when I discovered that the small college savings fund my grandfather had set up for me had been completely drained. They'd taken it to pay off their debts without telling me. When I confronted them, there wasn't even a shred of remorse. They simply told me it was necessary to keep the family afloat. That was the moment I realized I couldn't stay. I was 18, and it was clear they saw me as nothing more than a resource to exploit. So, I packed up what little I had, left home, and moved to a nearby city for college. Those first few years were brutal. I worked long hours waitressing, tutoring, and doing whatever odd jobs I could find just to make ends meet. I was constantly juggling work and school, but even with all the challenges, I felt a sense of freedom I'd never known before. For the first time, I didn't have to answer to anyone but myself. I kept my distance from my parents after that. I'd call on holidays or special occasions, mostly out of obligation, but deep down, I hoped that maybe, just maybe, the space would make them reflect on how they treated me. Years later, I graduated with my degree and got a full-time job in another state. It was everything I'd worked so hard for, a decent salary, good benefits, and the chance to finally build a stable life. Moving hundreds of miles away was a fresh start. I found my own apartment, made friends who genuinely cared about me, and began building the life I'd always dreamed of. For 2 years, I didn't hear a word from my parents. Honestly, I thought they'd finally let go of the idea that I owed them something. But then, out of nowhere, they reached out. They said they wanted to reconnect and were planning a visit, promising they had a special surprise for me. The message floored me. After all those years of silence, they were acting like nothing had ever happened, like we were some happy family that had just drifted apart. They hinted that this surprise would somehow fix everything, but I couldn't help feeling suspicious. Every so-called surprise in the past had come with strings attached, guilt, manipulation, or both. When I politely declined their visit, things escalated fast. Suddenly, I was getting calls and messages from relatives, all piling on the guilt. Your parents miss you, they said. It's time to let the past go. Some even accused me of being too harsh, saying my parents were just trying to make amends. But no one seemed to remember the sacrifices I'd made, the years of struggle it took to break free from their control. The guilt-tripping didn't let up. Message after message came in, filled with the same tired lines: family is family, everyone deserves a second chance, and you only get one set of parents. But after everything I'd been through, I couldn't help but ask myself, did I really owe them another chance? For years, I had shouldered the weight of their bad decisions, putting my own life on hold to help them maintain the shiny image they were so desperate to project. My peace, my dreams, and even my future had been sacrificed to keep them afloat. And the moment I stopped being useful to them, they discarded me like I was nothing. Now, after finally clawing my way out and building a life for myself, they suddenly wanted back in. So here I am, stuck in this mental tug-of-war between the family I was born into and the life I fought tooth and nail to create for myself. There's a part of me that wonders if I'm wrong for wanting to stay distant, wrong for choosing myself over the people who only ever saw me as a means to their own ends. But I know who my parents are, and I know what they're capable of. This surprise they've been hinting at feels like just another attempt to manipulate me. Still, no matter how much I try to push it aside, I can't completely shake the guilt they planted in me. That little voice in my head whispers, you owe them, they're your parents. It's infuriating how deeply that feeling is rooted. So, Reddit, I need to ask, am I wrong for wanting to be free? After everything they've done, am I wrong for refusing to let them back into my life now that I've finally started living on my own terms? Update 1. First off, I want to say thank you. The overwhelming support, advice, and shared stories from everyone have been incredible. Reading through your comments has been like a breath of fresh air, and it's helped me feel a little less alone in all of this. Seeing how many of you have gone through similar experiences has given me some much-needed clarity. One point that so many of you brought up really hit me: the way my parents are going about this whole thing, showing up out of nowhere with a surprise and expecting it to fix everything, proves they still don't fully understand the damage they've caused. It's like they're still trying to use money or grand gestures to fix things instead of addressing the deeper issues. Ironically, things escalated on their own shortly after I posted my original story. Yesterday morning, I got a call from my aunt, my mom's sister. She's always been more of a bystander in family drama, the type to stay neutral but occasionally step in with unsolicited advice. She didn't waste any time getting to the point. Apparently, my parents had confided in her about their plans to reconnect with me and had even shared the details of their big surprise. According to my aunt, they'd been seeing a family therapist for the past year. Supposedly, they'd been reflecting on their mistakes and working on themselves. The surprise, as she explained it, was a trust fund they'd set up in my name. My parents had saved up some money and intended to give it to me as a way of apologizing and making things right. I didn't know how to feel about it. On one hand, hearing that they'd been in therapy and had saved up something for me felt like some kind of acknowledgement. A part of me wanted to believe they'd really changed. But as I thought more about it, I couldn't ignore how much it frustrated me. Their whole plan still revolved around money, something they'd used as both a tool and a weapon against me for years. It felt like they were trying to buy my forgiveness instead of putting in the hard work to rebuild trust and repair the damage they'd done. After sitting with my thoughts for a while, I decided I couldn't just leave things hanging. I needed to address this directly. So last night, I sat down and wrote a long email to my parents. In the email, I thanked them for the effort they claimed to have put into therapy. I acknowledged that if they were genuinely reflecting on their behavior, that was a big step. But I also made it clear that showing up with a financial gesture wasn't the way to fix things. I told them, bluntly, that if they were serious about reconciliation, it needed to start with respecting my boundaries and being willing to have honest, open conversations about what had happened. I suggested we take things slow, start with regular phone calls or messages where we could both work on rebuilding trust. I emphasized that if they were truly committed to making amends, it would take time and consistency, not just a one-time gesture. I even pointed out that if their therapy was actually helping, they should know by now that reconciliation isn't something you can buy or rush. I ended the email by setting a clear boundary: I would not be accepting any visits or surprises until we'd laid the groundwork for a healthier relationship. Whether they're willing to meet me halfway is still up in the air, but for the first time in a long while, I feel like I'm standing my ground. After hitting send, I felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. On one hand, I'd finally set boundaries and communicated exactly what I needed. On the other, I knew my parents well enough to expect some kind of backlash. Sure enough, the next morning, their reply landed in my inbox. At first glance, their message seemed polite. They thanked me for being honest and expressed a willingness to follow my lead if that's what it took to fix things. But as I kept reading, the tone shifted. My mother wrote paragraph after paragraph about how families shouldn't need rules or boundaries, implying that my request for space and respect was somehow unnatural. She said if I was truly serious about reconciling, I would have let them visit and talk face to face. Then came my father's part of the email, which was more direct and, honestly, cutting. He said he felt hurt and disrespected by my refusal to accept their gift, emphasizing how much effort it took for them to put it together. It was clear they didn't see my boundaries as reasonable, they saw them as rejection. The subtext of their message was impossible to ignore. I was the one at fault for not being forgiving enough, for not meeting them halfway. What really stung was a line from my mother that felt like a dagger: "You've always been independent to a fault." It hit me because, for so long, I'd fought to stand on my own 2 feet precisely because they never gave me the support or stability I needed. Independence wasn't a choice for me, it was a survival mechanism. Yet here they were, framing it as a flaw, another way to shift blame onto me. Reading that email was like being slapped in the face. They hadn't really changed. Everything I'd shared about my struggles growing up, about how their actions had hurt me, seemed to be completely ignored. Instead, they twisted the narrative, making me feel like the ungrateful child all over again. As if that wasn't enough, my aunt called me later that evening. It was obvious she'd been talking to my parents because she launched right into a speech about how hard they were trying and how I was being too harsh. "They're really making an effort, you know," she said. "It's not easy for them either. Maybe you should give them a chance to show they've changed." She even mentioned that their therapist had encouraged them to reach out, as if that somehow justified their behavior. I tried to explain, again, that a one-time grand gesture like a trust fund wasn't a substitute for real accountability or consistent effort. But by the end of the call, I felt like I was hitting my head against a wall. No one seemed to understand, or maybe they just didn't want to. All I wanted was for my parents to respect my boundaries, to show me they'd changed through their actions, not by throwing money at the problem or guilt-tripping me into submission. It was exhausting. I felt like I was being backed into a corner, forced to defend my choices over and over. Setting boundaries should have been empowering, but instead, it felt like I was being punished for daring to protect my peace. I never wanted to be in this position. I never wanted to be seen as the ungrateful daughter who wouldn't let her parents back into her life. But after everything they put me through, I knew I didn't deserve this. I've worked so hard to build a life for myself, a life free from their manipulation and control. I wasn't about to let them take that away from me. Update 2. I honestly didn't expect things to escalate this much in just a few days. After sending that last email, I hoped my parents would take a step back and at least try to respect my decision. Instead, it feels like they've doubled down, and I'm starting to see just how far they're willing to go to reassert control over me. 2 days after my last post, I woke up to a text from an unknown number. It read, "Hope you're doing well in your new city. Don't think you can hide forever. We'll see you soon." My heart stopped. At first, I thought it was spam or some random scam message. But as I reread it, the tone felt disturbingly familiar. It reminded me of the way my father used to leave subtle, guilt-laden reminders when he wanted me to feel uneasy about something. I tried to brush it off, but it rattled me more than I wanted to admit. Later that day, I received an email from my father. It was formal, almost businesslike, and laced with passive-aggressive undertones. He wrote that he was disappointed by my lack of willingness to accept their hand of reconciliation. He didn't outright threaten me, but the language was pointed. He mentioned that as their only child, it was my moral responsibility to meet them halfway and at least acknowledge their efforts. One line, in particular, sent me over the edge: "We invested so much in your education and upbringing. Now is not the time to repay us with silence and distance." Reading between the lines, it was clear what he was implying. My success and independence, the life I'd built for myself, were things I owed to them. And because of that, it was my duty to keep them close, to be grateful. It was infuriating, but more than that, it confirmed what I'd been afraid of all along: they weren't going to respect my boundaries. That night, I sat in my apartment, replaying everything in my head. The text, the email, the call from my aunt, it all felt like an elaborate web meant to trap me back into their control. No matter how much I've grown or how far I've come, it seems like they're determined to pull me back into the role I worked so hard to escape. But here's the thing: I'm not the same person I was when I left home. I've fought too hard and sacrificed too much to let them take away my freedom now. That evening, I called my closest friend, Julie, someone who had known me and my family for years. I poured out everything: the texts, the emails, the phone calls, and she listened quietly until I ran out of steam. Then, in her steady, reassuring way, she reminded me of something I'd known deep down but needed to hear out loud: my parents have always pushed boundaries. She said this latest escalation was just another way of testing me to see how far they could go before I gave in. "You don't owe them anything," Julie said firmly. "It's okay to keep your distance. You're not obligated to let them back into your life on their terms, especially if it's making you this miserable." Her words were like a lifeline. For the first time in days, I felt a wave of relief. I wasn't crazy or overreacting; what they were doing was manipulative, plain and simple. But that relief was short-lived. The next day, I noticed my parents had both followed me on Instagram. My stomach dropped. I kept my profile private and carefully curated, using it only to stay connected with old college friends. I had never blocked my parents because, up until now, they'd shown no interest in social media. Seeing their names pop up felt invasive, like they were trying to force their way into a space I'd deliberately kept separate from them. Then it got worse. My mother started liking old posts, including one from 2 years ago when I first moved to this state for work. It felt calculated, like she wanted me to know she was digging through my life, leaving breadcrumbs to remind me they were still watching. That night, my aunt called again. She sounded chipper, but her words were anything but comforting. "Have you spoken to your parents? They're really worried about you," she said, her tone teetering between concern and passive aggression. When I told her I hadn't, she sighed dramatically and added, "Well, they know where you live. They're thinking about flying out to see you. Just a quick visit to talk things through, you know? They want to set things straight." The way she said it, as if it was no big deal, sent chills down my spine. My aunt framed it like they were doing me a favor, but it was obvious they had already decided to show up uninvited. She even went so far as to say I was overreacting and making this a bigger deal than it needed to be. The worst part wasn't her dismissive tone or the subtle guilt trips. It was realizing they knew where I lived. I had never shared my address with them when I moved here. I wanted a clean break, a chance to build a life without their interference. The fact that they'd somehow found it, whether through other relatives or an online search, made me feel exposed and vulnerable. That night, I sent my parents another email. I kept my tone calm but firm, reiterating that I wasn't comfortable with surprise visits. I told them that if they truly wanted to mend our relationship, they needed to respect my boundaries and stop tracking me down or following me online. I hoped that by spelling it out so clearly, they'd finally get the message. But of course, they didn't. The response came quickly, and it was exactly what I feared. My mother wrote a long, guilt-laden email about how heartbroken they were that I was treating them like strangers. She framed their persistence as an act of love, saying they were only trying to support me in the way they thought I needed. "Someday, you'll look back and regret pushing us away," she wrote. "We're doing this for you, to help you heal from the past." It was exhausting. No matter how many times I explained myself, they twisted my words and intentions to make me look like the ungrateful child who didn't appreciate their love. I sat there for hours, trying to process the emotional weight of it all. When I finally gathered myself, I sent one final message. It was blunt, almost painfully so, but I knew it was necessary. I told them that if they showed up at my home uninvited, I would call the police. This wasn't a negotiation. I wasn't being dramatic. I was serious. If they truly cared about me, they would respect my need for space and stop interfering in my life. The fallout was immediate. The next day, I got a call from a cousin on my father's side, someone I hadn't heard from in years. She'd heard through the family grapevine that I'd threatened my parents with police action and wanted to know what was going on. Her tone was full of judgment, like she couldn't believe I'd gone that far. "Your parents have been through so much," she said. "Isn't there a way to work this out peacefully?" I almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. It felt like everyone in the family was reading from the same script, parroting the narrative my parents had spun. No one seemed interested in my side of the story, only in convincing me to fall back in line. That night, I went through all my social media accounts and tightened every privacy setting I could find. I even blocked certain family members who'd shown an interest in meddling. It was a small but necessary step to reclaim my sense of security. I also decided to get a P.O. box for any future mail, just in case they tried to send letters to my home. But what happened yesterday was the final straw. It solidified everything I'd been feeling and made me more determined than ever to hold my ground. Yesterday, I got an email from my apartment's management office that made my stomach twist into knots. They informed me that someone had shown up at the front desk asking to confirm if I lived there. The staff, thankfully, didn't share any information, but the description they provided sounded uncomfortably familiar: broad-shouldered, balding, with a stern look that could only belong to my father. My heart raced as I read the message. It wasn't just unsettling, it was terrifying. The thought of him showing up unannounced, as though his presence alone would force me to let down my guard, was a violation of every boundary I'd worked so hard to set. It wasn't just persistence anymore, it was outright intimidation. So here I am now, still standing firm but feeling a mix of exhaustion and fear. I've spent years carving out a life of independence, learning to advocate for myself in ways I never thought I could. But this whole ordeal has left me questioning how much more strength I have left to keep pushing them away. A small part of me feels guilty. I wonder if they'll ever truly understand why I need this space, or if they're just too lost in their own narrative to see the damage they've caused. But then, I remind myself of the years of manipulation, the emotional blackmail, and the constant reminders that my life was never fully my own around them. Update 3. It's been almost a month since things escalated, and I finally have some good news. My boyfriend and I made a decision that we'd been considering for a while. We decided to move in together. The recent chaos with my parents only solidified our choice. We found a small, cozy apartment a few towns over that felt like a fresh start. It's far enough away to put some distance between me and my parents, and knowing they no longer have my address has brought me a sense of relief I didn't realize I needed. We finalized the move last week, and while I'm still cautious, I finally feel like I've regained a measure of control over my life. Throughout this entire ordeal, my best friend Julie has been my rock. She's been there for every emotional twist and turn, always ready to listen or offer advice. Recently, she attended a family gathering where, to my dismay, my parents were also present. At first, I was nervous about them being in the same room, but I trusted Julie's judgment. When we spoke afterward, she told me how things had played out, and I was floored. Apparently, my parents have been telling anyone who will listen that I've abandoned them, that I'm ungrateful, and that they raised me with nothing but love, only for me to walk out and disrespect them. According to Julie, they painted me as some selfish, spoiled brat who had turned her back on the family that had given her everything. My mother even laid it on thick, talking about all the sacrifices they'd made for me growing up and spinning a tale that made it sound like I owed them everything. Hearing this made my blood boil. It was a warped version of reality, twisted to fit their narrative and win sympathy from anyone willing to listen. But Julie wasn't having it. She told me she stayed quiet at first, letting them dig their hole, but when they started twisting the story beyond recognition, she stepped in. She called them out in front of everyone, laying out the truth in no uncertain terms. Julie told them and everyone listening about the years of manipulation and emotional abuse I'd endured. She explained how they had dismissed my feelings, controlled me, and even used me for financial support when it suited them. She brought up their recent attempts to track me down, their refusal to respect my boundaries, and how they'd shown up uninvited despite my repeated requests for space. She didn't hold back. And the most surprising part? My parents didn't deny a single word. Julie said they sat there quietly, occasionally muttering things like, "We did so much for her," or, "But she's our daughter." They didn't refute her accusations, nor did they try to explain themselves. For the first time, they seemed to realize that their carefully constructed narrative wasn't going to hold up under scrutiny. After that confrontation, Julie noticed a shift in the room. People who had previously flocked to my parents, probably impressed by the image they'd always presented, began keeping their distance. Their social standing, which they clearly valued, started to crumble. It hit me then how much of their identity relied on external validation. They thrived on being seen as respected, upstanding members of the community. Now that the facade had cracked, they were left exposed and alone. Despite this, they didn't stop trying to reach me. For weeks, I received constant messages and emails, ranging from emotional pleas to outright guilt-tripping. My mother sent long letters about how I was tearing the family apart and breaking their hearts. They even resorted to calling me from blocked numbers, leaving voicemails that I stopped listening to altogether. I knew I needed to take a stronger stand. I sent them one final email, a simple but firm message. I told them that if they continued to harass me, I would involve the police. I explained that their behavior was crossing into stalking territory and made it clear that I wouldn't hesitate to file a restraining order if they didn't back off. For a few days, the tension was unbearable. Then, I received one last email from my mother. It was full of dramatic statements about how they'd only ever tried to do what was best for me and how I was throwing away the only family I had. The last line stood out to me: "One day, you'll regret this decision. You'll look back and wonder why you couldn't just let things go." It was the kind of veiled threat that used to make me second-guess myself. But this time, it didn't. If anything, it reinforced that I was doing the right thing. Since that message, things have gone quiet. For now, the silence feels like a victory, a moment to breathe and focus on rebuilding my life without their interference. I don't know if this is the end of the story or if they'll find another way to try to insert themselves into my life. But for now, I'm taking it day by day. I'm grateful for the steps I've taken, the people who've supported me, and the chance to start fresh. Thank you to everyone who's been here for me during this journey. It's been a long road, but I finally feel like I'm standing on solid ground again.